Hello everybody, welcome to this course on The Handmaid's Tale. This is relevant to you if you are an A-level literature student. You might be studying the novel as part of Pearson Edexcel's A-level literature for paper 2. If you are, that paper requires you to make comparative links with another pre-1900 novel for assessment objective 4. In the case of what I'm doing here, I will be briefly making links to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. If you're following that course, brilliant. If you're not, don't panic. It won't be anything other than brief. You can skip ahead or just bear briefly with it. It's equally relevant to you if you are studying Spec B or Spec A of AQA's A-level. You might be looking at OCR's literature A-level, which also features the novel as an option. Or if your centre, school, sixth form college, whatever it may be, is allowing you the option of Handmaids for the prose study on Educas's literature A-level, which I've also taught as part of film studies at one stage or another, it will be relevant to you. So, let's get into it. So a word of warning from the off, ladies and gents. This course is going to require us to look closely at the following assessment objectives. Objective 1 centres around the quality of your argument, your voice, as it were, within an exam response. And as part of that, you are going to be needing to shift away from the GCSE skills where you were really zooming in on close textual analysis. Yes, that will still be present and really, really vital, but you need to take care to make a broader argument of connections across not only one novel, but in the case of some exam specs, 2. That being the case, I've got to forewarn you straight away that I am going to be zooming in on things right at the end of the novel, almost immediately within this first session, to make connections about the quite clever circular structure that this novel has. So, that kind of spoiler is going to reveal aspects of plot because they're important. The historical notes and that palimpsest image on the first page that I'll be looking at later in this session make that vital. You will still, of course, for assessment objective 2, be analysing the way that language shapes meaning. I'm not arguing that you shouldn't be doing that. You will also need to bring in social and historical context, which is what this first session is going to chiefly look at, albeit very broadly, because there are so many of them in this novel. You will need to zoom in on them probably more meaningfully when they become relevant to specific bits of the text. That's what the exam board call engagement with social and historical context. It's no good to simply bolt on a bit of historic knowledge that you remember your teacher giving you. You need to be able to demonstrate how you are closely engaging with that, hand in hand with the textual analysis that you're doing. That might sound like jargon at the minute, but it will become a lot more clear in future episodes. You'll also need to be thinking, at least for Edexcel's course, about AO4 connections between the text. I will look at that, albeit quite briefly, and I don't want to neglect that too much because assessment objective 4, the links between 2 novels comparatively, is probably the bit that every year exam officers remark upon in their report being the weakest aspect, probably because it's the hardest. I don't want to overemphasize that here on YouTube when some of you may be watching this for purely The Handmaid's Tale rather than that skill set. But nevertheless, we will look at those AO4 links as we move on. When it comes to planning for an exam response, I actually think the AO4 links should be your starting position. What themes carry over the two? Because that will actually be the thing that drives your argument. And that's the chief difference between GCSE and A-level. You are forging an argument, in this case about the thematic links between two novels, and using those themes to drive your close analysis whilst engaging and integrating within, rather than simply bolting on, the social and historical contexts. So that being the case, I'm just warning you that there will be spoilers along the way of what happens toward the end if you haven't yet read the novel or the whole novel. My suggestion would be that if you're just starting out, give it a couple of weeks to get halfway and then a further fortnight to finish it. Everybody can get through a novel in a month. And my other recommendation would be that if you are new to dystopia, you may wish to, and I would strongly recommend, you read Orwell's 1984. Atwood acknowledges that it was a huge influence upon The Handmaid's Tale. And context doesn't just have to be about society or history, it can be literary in terms of genre too. So the first aspect of literary context might well be genre. What do you already know about the novel? What's it about? Who wrote it? When did the author write it? And what genre is it? As we move through the course, you're going to get used to me asking you to press pause. Probably doesn't do me much good in terms of a YouTube algorithm, but when I ask you to hit pause and do a countdown, do take the time to exercise your own brain and think about some ideas or jot some notes down before I move on to what you might have come up with. So at this point, alongside those bullets, I'm going to ask you please to just either jot down or in this case have a quick think about those bullets there. Hit pause for me now in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. I feel I need to just take pause at this point. After 11 years of teaching, and what must be now about 6 years of teaching A-level literature, and goodness, it must be about 17, 18, 19 years since taking the A-level myself, I have inadvertently not realised how much of my material on the forthcoming slides is indebted to the York Notes, and I want to just explicitly make that dedication and that citation of source so as not to be running into copyright issues, just for the sake of clarity. Thank you. So there are a few notes here that I've made to introduce the novel in general. I also want to look in this section at some of the literary techniques, aspects of genre, and indeed a brief overview of socio-historic context. So for me, this novel is a moral fable that attempts to be prophetic in order to warn against a scenario of catastrophe in the near future that Atwood hopes we can guard against by knowing our own history. So the historical notes at the end appear to show, several hundred years later, that the oppressive regime depicted has fallen. It's come to an end. The novel is epistolary. If you are not familiar with that term, it is made up of extracts which appear to be like a diary. If you've studied Frankenstein, then you are already familiar with that term and that technique. Here, although what we actually see as being diary-like and an eyewitness account, it later emerges that it's actually a transcription of testimony recorded on cassette tapes. And it's only at the end that we get a wider perspective on Offred's fragmented narrative. The historical notes give us the view that this is a distorted interpretation of the tale that we've just finished. I will look in greater detail later at the opening page of the novel, in which we get this ironic reference to the gym hall that the handmaids sleep in, metaphorically as being a palimpsest of the time before the totalitarian control of Gilead. Palimpsest meaning a document that has been written over, that has layers, much like the fictional historians have sequenced and edited the tape's transcription with a distorted male view. That may not make sense as yet, but it will do as we move further forward. Just as this regime has usurped or taken over by force women's rights, and many others, let alone women, so the historians have usurped Offred's story. And so the historical notes, and this is what I mean about beginning at the end, give a scholarly editor's reading of what they take to be an ancient document. They focus on reliability as a historic document and ignore the crucial aspect that is Offred's personal, private resistance. They are not bothered about her tale or story. They are looking at it as a matter of historic record that either is or is not accurate. They perhaps remove its emotional or human importance. The novel therefore becomes a warning against accepting potential misreadings of a secondary account. People in the historian's audience at the end could simply accept his view of it, or they could actually be looking at the original material and drawing their own conclusions, a bit like we shouldn't let the media or false news, fake news, steer our thinking on such a thing. On one level, inadequate interpretations are possible, and it might be fairly innocent. On another, recalling the dictatorial regime of Gilead, the media might have a deliberately misleading rhetorical angle as a means of control. And Atwood therefore is using satire in the historical notes to highlight that this document, the whole thing that she's written, is being cast in the light of being a skewed reconstruction of simply listening to the moral purpose of Offred's testimony. I'm only going to give a really broad overview of socio-historic context in this introductory episode. Normally I'd start with a lot more of this, but I'm only doing it briefly at this early stage because there are so many influences that inspire the novel. There is a lot of historical precedents. Notice precedents is the noun versus precedence, which would be the infinitive, that I think it will be a lot more meaningful for you to cover them in more engaging detail where they're really relevant to close analysis of the text. A key quotation that Atwood gave on this novel I'll be coming back to a number of times. One of the tasks that I set myself when writing the novel was to avoid including any practices which had not already happened somewhere at some time. One of the functions of the historical notes is to indicate the origins of some of the practices described in the novel. It's vital to understand that every single one of the practices described in the novel is drawn from the historic record. And so for me, Atwood has an allegorical and didactic purpose here. Didactic meaning to teach a lesson. Allegorical and didactic I'm combining here to be a bit like a parable, giving a or conveying a moral message, and that is, from my interpretation at least, of the historic notes, to warn us of a possible future if we don't remember historic atrocities, in order to ensure that the same social mistakes are not repeated again. And the historian that she depicts in the historic notes is very much doing that by not morally judging the regime that's depicted within The Handmaid's Tale. For the sake of expediting speed, I'm not going to go into the specifics of each of these socio-historic precedents now. I will raise that in much greater detail where it's analytically relevant. But of the many precedents that Atwood uses as inspiration, some would include the Holocaust. There are several allusions to the Holocaust, to the final solution and concentration camps of the Nazi regime of the 1930s and 40s. Much more recent Soviet East German historic elements up to the 1980s. One of the core foundation stones of the inspiration of the novel that Atwood does very much acknowledge is America's Puritan history, the Salem witch trials of 17th century Massachusetts. We'll discuss that when looking at the dedications as well that Atwood makes at the beginning of the novel. We might draw some parallels between America's Puritan history, the novel, and perhaps the McCarthy era of the US in 1950s, or indeed an intertextual link to the idea of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, which depicts a Puritan storyline, albeit written a couple of centuries after the fact. We mustn't forget more broad forms of context, the dystopian genre itself. Atwood said that she was thinking at the time in the 1980s when writing of what would be required for a revolution in the United States to win. And she came to the conclusion that politically it would have to claim God to be on its side. And she, as she feels anyway, was looking at what logical conclusion might come to be from the Christian right of President Reagan in the 1980s. She was writing in the mid-80s. She actually completed the novel whilst on a sabbatical in Berlin in 1984, at a time when Soviet East Germany and the Berlin Wall still existed. Other elements: America's history of slavery. Later, another black civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s under Martin Luther King. First and second wave feminism and the anti-feminist backlash that Atwood and her politics, at least, associate with the Christian right of Reagan's 1980s presidency. Institutional control of human reproduction, again perhaps reminiscent of Nazi Germany and other countries. Contemporary concerns about test tube babies, cloning, Dolly the sheep, which you might not be familiar with now, surrogacy, abortion, pornography. The threats of not only environmental change, but technologies like nuclear having an effect on things like birth rates. Militant nationalism, racism, political and religious extremism, the control of people through credit cards. We get depicted a social takeover whereby people's cards are simply switched off on the basis of being the woman within the household. So, as I've said, we'll go into much greater detail when they arise in the text, but that gives you a broad overview of just how wide the range of possible precedents is. So just as a quick recap, What is the genre of the novel? Pause for me, please, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We can call the genre of The Handmaid's Tale dystopian fiction, and we'll look at Atwood's views on that category a little later. Do you know anything about the genre? Can you name any dystopian TV shows, films, novels? Check out the dystopian flowchart on my next slide and see if you can identify anything that you might have seen or read that fits into this category. Okay, so this flowchart is not something of my own invention. Credit to Erin Bowman, who allows for this to be shared and used for these purposes. This is a very tongue-in-cheek, funny way of exploring some aspects of dystopia. Dystopia can mean several things. It can overlap with things like the Gothic or science fiction especially. So if we start in the middle, are things pretty perfect? Yes. Has society or the government or someone in charge solved all of humanity's problems and now everything is just dandy? No, but things are still pretty perfect. Your world sounds lovely. If yes, do any of their controlling solutions include conformity, restricted freedom, censorship, constant surveillance, key life choices being decided for you, enforced drug or medicine use? If the answer's no, then stop whining, your world's awesome. If the answer's yes, then actually it's pretty far from perfect. It might have set out as a utopia, but its level of control has become dystopian. Is there a better way? Do you want to start questioning things? If you don't, then perhaps visit a psychiatrist. Or if you do want to resist, then you might be in a dystopia of the same sort as 1984 or The Giver. Orwell's 1984 centres around a regime that completely controls language in order to control thinking. It rewrites history to erase memories, and people are vaporised if they rebel. In a very similar way, The Giver centres around a black and white utopian world in which nobody has a memory of the world prior to the regime, and the memories are kept by the giver. It's an interesting film, if you've seen it or not, starring Jeff Bridges, with a little cameo by Taylor Swift, which is the reason I watched it, if I'm honest. All of these things would fit into some form of a dystopian category. If things are not pretty perfect, are you the victim of a terrible accident, a plane crash, an unethical experiment, etc.? If so, are you trapped while the rest of the world carries on without you? Must you resort to making your own rules in society to survive? Are things super stressful, people fighting, order 2 seconds away from erupting into chaos? You might be in some sort of isolated dystopia like The Maze Runner, or maybe, arguably, Lord of the Flies. The other category that Erin Bowman comes up with here is something that I would actually argue is still part of dystopia, the post-apocalyptic world being depicted. Has the world crumbled in a horrific downfall? Are there zombies? That would be post-apocalyptic. Is there a virus? That might be post-apocalyptic. A war, a natural disaster, a technological revolt. Think of a number of basically think about Will Smith films, I Am Legend, a zombie post-apocalypse, or I, Robot, this kind of technological revolt. Just a bit of tongue-in-cheek fun there to get you to grips with some of the basic principles of a dystopia. So here's a very narrow overview of some examples of dystopian novels. George Orwell's 1984, Panoptic State Surveillance, Control of the Mind, Control by Fear, Censorship. Cormac McCarthy's The Road depicts a post-apocalyptic world. Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 talks about the widespread censorship of book burning. Both 1984 and Fahrenheit 451 centre around keeping people less educated and less intelligent in order to stem the threat of rebellion. Never Let Me Go by Katsuo Ishiguro centres around what appears on the outside to be a well-heeled boarding school that is actually for clones of well-to-do people within society, such that they can have their bodies harvested for new organs as and when illness arises. So, literary contexts, genre. It's a dystopian science fiction novel, like George Orwell's 1984, and in this case, it's a woman's fictive autobiography. It seems to be like a diary. It speculates about a scenario rooted in scientific possibility, whereby a dictatorial regime seeks to take control to solve the widespread declining birth rate. Atwood argues that it's no accident that her descriptions of the Republic of Gilead allude to Massachusetts and the Harvard University city of Boston. This state was the setting of the Salem witch trials, which is also explored in Arthur Miller's Crucible, which he wrote as a non-too-subtle resistance of blacklisting by Senator Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. McCarthy was part of a movement that sought to eradicate through fear-mongering the idea that in the post-Second World War II world, we didn't want a swing from extreme right-wing to extreme left-wing politics. And many playwrights, people in the arts, were perhaps wrongly, because of liberal politics, viewed as being communist sympathisers. He writes a play about a witch hunt to depict what he took to be a witch hunt, having been blacklisted. It might be that some of you have studied Miller as part of your A-level studies. You could potentially have studied Death of a Salesman. It's not likely that you've studied The Crucible, although it's possible depending on what course you follow. A bit of trivia for you on Miller is that he was at one time, for a brief period, married to Marilyn Monroe. Whilst it's difficult to ignore the vast range of historical precedents there are in the novel, the Puritan history of America is definitely one of the chief ones. And it's worth noting at this point parallels to Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, revolving around a Puritan community's treatment of a woman accused of adultery. I think that's one of the inspirations that the red colour of the Handmaid's uniform comes from, although Atwood does perhaps slightly facetiously say that that comes from a detergent manufacturer that she remembered from childhood and the pictures on it. So, dystopia, an imagined society that's frighteningly on the edge of possibility. It's a near future that is close enough to our own that we are all the more eerily frightened by how easily we could slip into this kind of thing if we allow government to control us too much. Within the fiction, it might be that the story world, the diegesis, is attempting to dictate a utopia, but offering a model of a near future that attacks present-day society or warns against the consequences of particular kinds of political or social behaviour. A didactic commentary that warns us not to let little things that seem like they're for a good reason lead to a level of control that leads to the likes of the Holocaust or some sort of abhorrent atrocity of that nature. Like science fiction, dystopias are often rooted in a realistic possibility and are postmodern in that they need to be read with a knowledge of the social context of their own time. They're eerie, they're all the more frightening because they're close enough to reality by depicting a near future that makes them frighteningly feasible. Here, the warnings are against the threats of environmental pollution, religious fundamentalism and state surveillance. The novel has been read to some extent as anti-Christian. I certainly remember when I read it as an A-level student of 17 myself being uncomfortable with it up to a point, but I think one can choose to read it as actually just warning against dictatorial state control in general. The novel can also be read as embodying the feminist values of a marginalised gender, giving the narrative authority to a group of people whose voices have been formally silenced in this fictional scenario, and indeed you could say in reality up to a point. It's a dystopia that presents an arranged society with highly regulated systems of social control and a hierarchy and punishment for those who violate that society's laws. The commander counters Offred's objections to Gilead as better never seems better for everyone. It always means worse for some, which for me brings to mind Orwell's Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. If you're unfamiliar, Animal Farm is a none too subtle allegory that seems like a child's farmyard story, but actually depicts communism, something that in the name of communist equality usually seeks to propagate its own power at the expense of keeping the poor poorer. Some of the things that we see within Atwood's Gilead are patriarchal control, men very much having the power and status. A kind of state-sponsored polygamy. Commanders are assigned a second woman, not their wife, in order to reproduce. Not literally a wife, and therefore not literally polygamy, having more than one wife. But I use that term as a kind of quasi-parallel to this concept. In either way, women are second-class citizens. It's totalitarian. It is governed by having taken over by force, having usurped. It is a dictatorship. The powers that be have not been democratically elected. There is censorship in order to eradicate any kind of dissenting voice to the regime. That goes hand in hand with propaganda. You must be seen to be supporting the regime. Nothing else is safe. And indeed, there is a very prescriptive state control of language used by citizens in order to ensure that black and white loyalty rather than rebellion is the only choice. Offred is part of a transitional generation. She is the first generation that have suffered this takeover and consider it to be abnormal. Somebody of her young daughter's age will not have the living memory of the kind of freedoms that Offred enjoyed. And so Offred, as an educated woman, clings to memories of colloquial slang turns of phrase from the time before the regime that have been quashed by Gilead's twisting of biblical terms and rhetoric for handmaid's greetings, blessed be the fruit, may the Lord open, etc., and turned these linguistic things into rituals. Rather than a means of actual meaningful communication, the purpose here is to smother dissenting voices that could rebel. It takes words with reassuring emotional connotations and distorts them into euphemisms for oppression. That's very reminiscent of Orwell's Newspeak in 1984 that we will come to have a little look at a little later in this episode. The historical notes show Atwood's assertion that this scenario was socially unworkable, comparing them to Orwell's note on Newspeak at the end of 1984. There is something that appears to be a postscript about Newspeak at the end of Orwell's novel that, just by its subtly being written in the past tense, gives readers a hope that such a regime couldn't survive. Similarly, we get this wonderful sense of relief at the end of Handmaid's Tale that the historical notes show that Gilead fell. But at the same time, it's tainted with the fact that some lessons, like the historian's misogyny, have not been learned. The Handmaid's Tale, however, is told by a woman on the periphery. She's on the edge of this regime and its workings. Whilst Winston in 1984 works for the Ministry of Truth, he actually creates propaganda by altering historical records to fit the party's accounts of what happened in the past. And hence he's in a position of greater knowledge than the average perspective in this dictatorial state. Offred is forbidden from writing altogether, and she can only gain anecdotal knowledge of the ways in which the regime functions. So you might want to think about how The Handmaid's Tale works to shock readers into a recognition of the evils of our contemporary world. Feminism is a very key context to the novel. The Supreme Court in 1973 rendered abortion legal within the states. It's a long time since I've done that research, so don't quote me on that. Do a little bit of research of your own. But pro-life campaigners under the Equal Rights Amendment, they didn't ratify the Equal Rights Amendment in 1982. I want to be careful about stating my own opinions on the abortion debate here. I've always thought it actually quite unhelpful to have such a polarised idea of either being pro-life or pro-choice. I don't think that those two opposite antithetical terms are really that helpful. I think somebody can be pro-life and potentially consider an abortion equating to murder, whilst also acknowledging the fact that there are circumstances, whether it be medical, whether it be in horrible circumstances like the result of a rape, whereby it is absolutely a woman's right to choose. I certainly would never seek a society that made abortion illegal, but I don't think a polar opposition between pro-life and pro-choice is actually that helpful. I sometimes think that we quickly, perhaps too quickly, associate a pro-life agenda with a Christian agenda. But that is one of the contexts that is here. And Offred recalls her apathy to her mother's feminist activism. It is something that we'll look at in greater detail in future episodes. Gilead's regime, taking a Christian perspective to a fundamentalist extreme, aims to re-educate women into traditional gender roles. I want to caveat that I do not consider Christianity fundamentalist at all. and I don't consider a pro-life attitude fundamentalist at all. By using the term fundamentalist, I am talking about the fictional depiction here of a state which takes control to such a dictatorial extent. So, narrative techniques. It's an autobiographical narrative that challenges the authority of the state of Gilead. Storytelling becomes a form of resistance. The witnessing and retelling of Offred's story voices her point of view, where the regime demands a silence. It's only really possible for her after some sort of escape, which seems to have only been a partial escape, given the revelation at the end that it's actually a jumble of cassette tapes from an archaeological dig. And thus, the fact that she refers to her tale as limping and mutilated subtly alludes to this revelation at the end of it having had to be reconstructed by the fictional historian that we get revealed at the end. The oppression of Offred, and this is a novel whereby I don't think you can possibly analyse without talking about the concept of oppression of both her and her story, is projected far into the fictional future by the historical notes. They've been transcribed by a male historian who devalues her even in a future which appears to have given status back to women and native communities. That will become more clear as we move forward. Professor Piexoto's phallic jokes whereby he relates the word Handmaid's Tale to tail as in a colloquialism for penis, assert that lessons haven't been learned in terms of sexism, misogyny, sexist jokes. The name Piexoto is something that Atwood lifts from a character's Portuguese name in a Brazilian South American novel. The character is somebody who is reincarnated century after century, and I think this alludes to the idea of being doomed to make the same historic mistakes over and again, implying that some of these sexist attitudes will remain. He's concerned with establishing authenticity and value as an objective historical piece of evidence, nothing emotive, not Offred as an individual, and he doesn't regard her testimony as reliable. His transcription and reconstruction is a shift from her story, her tale, and I think he's chosen the term tale to try to diminish its status, to history. Her story, history, containing the patriarchal male pronoun his. It's something that I call a mosaic. It's a discontinuous narrative of frequent time shifts, lots of analeptic shifts. It has quite episodic short scenes that aren't chronological, and therefore we have to piece it together, even down to an unfinished ending, which perhaps serves to re-emphasise the sense of oppression that's depicted therein. Offred is boxed in, perhaps a little bit like the creature is boxed between the metadiegetic and intradiegetic narratives of Walton and Victor Frankenstein, trapped in the middle. And so she's so limited that details become really important to her. Little remembrances become a kind of therapy. The novel's really compelling for me. It's one of the most enjoyable novels I've read and one of the most frightening because it shifts from present to past to a near future that's frighteningly feasible, and it slowly reveals things that have been withheld. And it's that which makes, for me, the film adaptation quite poor, because it doesn't establish an oppressive atmosphere. The Hulu series, which has recently been on Channel 4 over the last few years, is really, really good. If you want to watch it, by all means do. Season 1 depicts the novel. season 2, 3, 4, beyond are actually beyond the content of the novel. But it's really well put together, even when it departs from the novel, because I think of Atwood being part of the production team. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this episode. The night sections that occur really frequently use Offred's flashbacks to the time before as a kind of relaxing return to the remembered past. It's how she survives psychologically from her separation from husband and child, not knowing what their respective fates have really been, especially her husband, perhaps a little less so her child, while subject to indoctrination at the Rachel and Leah Centre and her life subsequently. She's got a determination to resist Gilead's efforts to erase her individual identity. She uses these remembrances as therapy, perhaps, escapism, whilst rationing them so as not to send herself mad. She remembers little turns of phrase which are of no consequence to us because we have a freedom of language use. Language from the time before to help retain her sanity. It's not just nostalgia, it's an escape mechanism. She goes on to seek solace from Nick because she feels so isolated and alone, and she's conflicted about that because of her memory of her husband Luke, and whether this is a betrayal, this physical connection, not knowing whether he is dead or not. Another technique that's used, that's nothing really to do with the structure of the novel, is the idea of doubling, the doppelganger, especially the erasing of individuality by the handmaids looking so similar through their uniform. Although that doppelganger idea occurs in the novel in many other more sophisticated ways too that we'll explore later, and is definitely an analytical point of comparison with Frankenstein, should you need it. I won't be doing it now, but we will go on to do some really close symbolic analysis. I said at the opening of this episode that you didn't need to be doing GCSE close analysis. I don't mean that you won't be doing close analysis, you will, but you need to be forging an argument. And A-level, advanced level literary analysis is as much about what you choose to not include within your argument as what you do. We need to think about the way that Atwood chooses to have Offred dwell upon really small words like chair, or the symbolism of something small like eating a boiled egg. What the effect of biblical language is, having been edited by Gilead to omit things to do with freedom as opposed to oppression. The way that language is used as a tool in that way of power, of oppression, and by prescribing language so narrowly, inhibiting individuals' freedom of expression. The biblical patriarchal Old Testament language being twisted as a means of social control. The way that Offred uses a lot of imagery relating to nature and organic processes. That's a very generic thing to say at this point, but we'll zoom in on precise details and examples in future episodes. The symbolism of the illicit game of Scrabble, which seems like a mundane thing in our world, but actually becomes a very dangerous and sexually charged thing within that chapter. The fact that she is known, like a slave, by her patronymic, patriarchal patronym, the patriarch's, the man's of the house, ownership of Offred. She becomes of Fred. She's the transitional generation. She's the first wave that has the power of being a survivor from the past to remember, and thus perhaps have a little hope of rebellion before a generation that wouldn't remember any other way than this lack of freedom. Notice that there is chiefly a lack of speech marks in the novel as well. which just very subtly hints at the revelation we get at the end, that this is actually a transcription of cassette recordings. So that's a lot by way of introduction, but that's the nature of the novel. Let's now actually jump into getting into some core content. Here's an overview of where we're going in the coming episodes, and if it's your first reading of the novel and you've not yet actually read through it or got all the way through it, don't be lazy and not read it. You can't approach A-level that way. This hopefully gives you an overview of how to approach the novel. It's divided into 46 fairly short chapters, plus a postscript, the historical notes, that's part of the novel and you really do need to read. Don't make the mistake of not reading it. It's part of the fiction and vital to the novel's intended message. It's divided into 15 numbered and named sections: shopping, waiting room, and so on. And over the course, we'll be looking at one section at a time, so you'll need to read ahead in order to know what to expect. The bullet points I've got here are intended to give you an idea of how to approach chunking the reading down. The timings are nothing to do with my episodes. That's roughly an average reading time for each section. So the first two sections, night and shopping, are covered in this episode and episode 3. Your reading time ought to be about an hour. Between those two, my next episode will look a little more at themes and contexts. A second night episode and waiting room is covered in episodes 4 and 5, roughly an hour's reading. Your next hour and a half of reading should cover nap, household, and another repetition of a night section. I'll be covering those over the course of episodes 6, 7 and 8. Birthday and night will be about an hour and a half's reading for you across episode 8 and 9. Again, nothing to do with my episode times or lengths. That's your reading time ahead. Soul Scrolls and night are another hour and a half's reading that I'll be covering in episodes 9 and 10. Jezebels, perhaps about 2 hours, episode 10. Night and the Salvaging, about 2 hours, episode 11. Night and the Historical Notes, a bit of essay planning work, episode 11, roughly an hour. And at that point, we'll be ready for episode 12 to look at some revision techniques, exam techniques and approaches. And then in the final episode, some exam response examples. So before we actually jump into some actual close reading, I'd like you to take a look at this range of hardback and paperback covers of the novel over the years and comment on the connotations, images and symbols of each cover. Take a good long pause to do this, really think about each of them, and consider the title of the novel, The Handmaid's Tale. What does tale suggest? I'm going to get you now to pause in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So on the top left, the first cover we've got there depicts a woman who has had her mouth stitched. The idea being that she is so oppressed she is unable to speak. A little like having one's tongue cut out, not being able to express opinions that are dissenting against the regime. The next one is my favourite, perhaps nostalgically because this was the cover when I was an A-level student of 17 myself. But this impressionistic style painting means that the cloaked handmaid, aside from being blinkered, being unable to see in peripheral vision, is faceless. Her identity has been erased. A more contemporary cover, third along from the left, depicts a handmaid in a very passive position, kneeling. The wings of her outfit again suggesting being blinkered, being unable to have the fullest possible perspective on things. The pears being fruit, perhaps symbolising the idea of fruit of the womb, kneeling, praying to God for this offspring. The purity of the white dove. The toxic waste type symbol depicted therein too. On the top right, we have the handmaids alongside a wall. This might be a number of possible things. It could be an allusion to the wall outside Harvard University, where in the fiction of the novel, bodies are hung as an example of what happens to a traitor. It shows the idea of being entrapped within the regime. It could also perhaps, at least parallel to some extent, the idea of regimes involving things like the Berlin Wall. Finally, we've got a very unusual, disturbing image on the bottom right that I don't know quite so readily what to make of, depicting a man who is holding what seems to be a kind of distorted version of the Woman and Madonna. The idea of the Madonna holding a child. Perhaps it equates to the idea of the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus up to a point. But there is something here that's distorted and disturbing in the disturbingly distorted looking baby sitting on the lap of a man. This warping of reproduction for the purposes of the male in the case of this regime. The Handmaid's Tale is actually what the fictive historian, Professor Piexoto, calls the transcription of the recordings at the end. He makes a lewd sexual joke of the double entendre of tail, spelt T-A-I-L, being a colloquialism for penis, to make some sort of phallic sexual joke. It also diminishes the story. A tale makes it sound flippant, unimportant, like a fairy tale, like something that one can dismiss offhand. And I think he would like to dismiss this as more story than accurate historic record. At the same time, we might feel that emotionally we would want this to be fiction. We would want this to be a tale of warning and not reality. We would not want such historic atrocities to actually repeat themselves or be possible within our world. That she can only hope that it's a tale she's telling, that it's a story that she's telling, so as to control the ending, when actually she can't control that oppressive ending. And I think that on a deeper emotional level, that also brings us to the concept of how important it is in terms of human freedom to be able to have that freedom to witness and retell, as opposed to being oppressed and unable to actually tell the truth. If you've any other possible ideas that you want to add to that, by all means, add them to the comments below. By all means, ask any questions that you wish in the comments below, and I'll do my very best to get back to you. Okay, ladies and gents, straight away then, I'm going to introduce the term theocracy. Is it a term that you're familiar with? If not, take pause now and have a think about it. Use the stem of the word to try to work it out from your head. And beyond that, hit Google and do a little bit of research. Hit pause for me in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A theocracy is a ruling group, usually dictatorial, usually a totalitarian regime, that rules unelected, not by democratic election, in the name of religion or God. Think about the stem theo from theology, belief in a faith or religious system, and you get to theocracy. In this fiction, a revolution's taken place, a civil war of sorts, and it's replaced the government of the US, or at least created a civil war where elements of the US must be elsewhere in other states. Details in the novel allude to Boston and New England, Massachusetts, which is here the fictive base of the totalitarian Republic of Gilead. If you look at this real map of the US, or at least the northeastern US, you can see the border with Canada, and you can see the northeastern states of Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts and Connecticut, along with Rhode Island. Below them is New York. Those 5 or 6 states are known as New England because they are the site of the original Puritan settlers of the US. So when I refer to New England, I mean Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont and Maine. We know that the novel is related by a woman called Offred, at least the regime has imposed that name on her. She's in her mid-30s. She's been separated from her husband and young daughter and sent to a brainwashing centre as part of a bid to help the ruling class improve the declining birth rate through a disturbing system of state-sponsored polygamy of sorts, in which commanders are permitted a wife plus a handmaid with whom to produce a baby. In her training as a handmaid, she will be obliged to serve any member of the hierarchy as birth mother of his children. Offred's on her 3rd assignment, having failed to become pregnant in her previous 2, so her time's running out. If she doesn't have a child soon, she'll be designated an unwoman and exiled to clean up toxic waste in one of the colonies until this kills her through radiation poisoning inside roughly 2 years. Unwomen, like Jews, African Americans, Catholics and other groups considered undesirable by Gilead, are not allowed in the regime. It's not somewhere that allows the other. Does this segregation reflect any significant historical events? And if so, how? Pause for me in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You might find that you think of segregation such as apartheid under South Africa, the separation of white communities and black ghettos. You might think of Martin Luther King's campaign of the civil rights movement of 50s and 60s in the States. Again, the segregation of black and white communities, even down to schools, buses, shops. You might bring to mind the idea of the Holocaust, seeking to erase not only the Jewish population, but the idea of other political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, those with other political or religious views. Any kind of attempt at genocide, the Rohingya, the refugee crisis in countries like Pakistan, the treatment of women in some Eastern countries, and so on and so forth. Catholic complicity within the Holocaust and a great many others. Offred is a walking womb. She describes herself as a two-legged womb, an ambulatory chalice, the chalice imagery creating this idea of an empty vessel to be filled with life, a little like the Holy Grail. Her only duty is to help maintain the declining white population. Atwood was inspired by research at the time into declining birth rates, leading to projections of countries like Romania and Germany and some Scandinavian countries falling below replacement level. I've put a little asterisk there to remind myself to talk to you about contextualising this a little bit. In the mid-80s, the likes of Germany would have been split between East and West Germany, capitalism, and still behind the Iron Curtain under the Soviet regime, East Germany. Romania was a communist country. These countries were, at that time, under a birth rate that would not have meant that they still existed as a race by the year 2020. Now, that's not come to be, as we know, here in 2022. But the likes of a country like Romania, which in the 80s, toward the end of the 80s, when the Soviet Union fell and the Berlin Wall fell in East Germany, would have been one of the last bastions of communism under Nicolae Ceausescu. And the poverty of the oppression of that regime would very likely have also led a lot of people in their 20s and 30s of usual childbearing age likely to have departed from their borders to look for work elsewhere, hence this concept of declining birth rates. Equally, however, there was and has continued to be a really declining birth rate globally. Perhaps that's through socioeconomic reasons. It might be to do with countries' dictatorial policies, China's one-child policy, but also Atwood has been keenly interested in and has in several of her dystopian novels looked at pollution, looked at environmental factors, and in this case speculating as to whether such a thing as chemicals and human technologies are actually self-destructively leading to this reduction of birth rates. And the novel depicts an extreme solution to that idea of a declining birth rate. Offred spends most of her time alone in a bare room, remembering her previous life, seeking mental escape, whilst worried that overindulging in such reminiscences might lead her to insanity. Her job is to reproduce for this regime. One of the core thematic concepts in this novel that really needs to be looked at is humanity's need for communication and companionship. And I think that that is definitely a prime foundation stone that one could use for assessment objective 4 links between this novel and Frankenstein, if that's relevant to you. Although everyone in Gilead is a potential informer, Offred establishes a bond with confidant Ofglen. She also has a secret affair with her commander's chauffeur Nick. Ofglen is another handmaid who she is guarded with to begin with, out of worry that she might be a true believer in the regime. They can only use prescribed language, and eventually Ofglen hints at using a code word to see if Offred is aware of it. Initially she isn't, but it eventually makes each one of them aware that the other is a potential resistance worker for a group called Mayday. Either way, this centres around the idea of communication and companionship. Nick comes to be a real help for her toward the end of the novel, seeming ambiguously, to arrange her escape, although it's not altogether clear. Nick arranges her escape via the underground female road, which can supposedly help her reach freedom across the border in Canada. We get a little bit more information about this in the historical notes. That name is one of Atwood's facetious uses of historical precedents. The name actually takes inspiration from the Underground Railroad, which was an actual real thing that was an effort by more progressive people during slavery to create a network route of safe houses to help slaves escape the southern states up through and across the border into Canada. Offred recasts it as the Underground Female Road, the same idea being that it's an escape route for handmaids. In the fiction of the novel, a van comes to collect Offred at the end. It's ambiguous as to whether she is being saved or whether she's being arrested as a potential enemy of the state. And we never get a full idea. It seems that they probably are saving her, but only insofar as bringing her into hiding. However, the revelation in the historical notes that the novel that we've been reading is actually a transcript of cassette tapes suggests that she made it at least as far as the freedom to make those recordings, albeit they've been camouflaged by music to disguise them. And so that suggests an ongoing life in hiding. She wouldn't have had the ability to record them in the commander's house. And if she'd got to Canada, she'd have been able to write it. So she must still be in some sort of safe house in hiding. What effect for you as a reader does that unresolved ending have? I wonder whether it increases our sense of the oppression of this regime. If it's still early days and you're unfamiliar, who's who in terms of the main characters? Our narrator is Offred. She's a handmaid in the Republic of Gilead, but she can remember the time before when she was married to Luke and had a daughter. Offglen, another handmaid, is Offred's shopping partner. She's also a member of an underground resistance movement we much later find out, called Mayday. Moira is Offred's feminist friend from the time before, who also ends up oppressed by being a handmaid. The commander is some sort of American Army vet and the master of Offred's third placement. Serena Joy is the commander's wife. She's a former singer on an evangelical Christian TV Bible show, later an advocate of the woman's return to the home that precedes the creation of this regime. Nick is a guardian assigned to Offred's household. If you're following the Edexcel course, it might be worth taking pause at this point to compare these characters with any of those in Frankenstein and why they have a parallel. But if not, we'll move on at this point. Just as I've advised you not to miss the historical notes at the end of the novel, don't miss out on the epigraphs before we actually start chapter 1. Equally, there's actually something not to miss before the epigraphs, the dedications, but I'll come to those in a future episode. Prior to chapter 1, these epigraphs set an important thematic agenda for the whole novel. The first is from the Bible, Genesis chapter 30 verses 1 to 3. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead? Who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, Behold my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. The second epigraph is from Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. But as to myself, having been wearied out for many years without offering vain, idle, visionary thoughts, and at length utterly despairing of success, I fortunately fell upon this proposal. The final of the three epigraphs is a Sufi proverb, Sufism being a religion. In the desert there is no sign that says, "Thou shalt not eat stones." Before we read the first chapter, what can we interpret from these? They set an important thematic agenda. Pause for me and have a good think. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In the first one, we might actually look at some of the language. In the second, we are going to discern very little without doing some external research. In the third, it should be fairly evident, and that's the point. The first, from the first book of the Bible, Genesis, is from the Old Testament. Gilead warps biblical scripture to justify the concept of the handmaids, often by quoting from it, accurately up to a point, but then omitting other things, not including them. Jacob's wife Rachel was barren. She was infertile, unable to have children, and so she asks her husband to sleep with her handmaid in order to essentially have a surrogate pregnancy. This is scripture that Gilead warps and uses to justify the concept of the handmaids. The second epigraph from Jonathan Swift is satirical. It suggests during the Irish potato famine that those who were poor should either sell their children to the rich or eat them. The third, from a proverb as part of Sufism, suggests that there shouldn't need to be any laws against the morally obvious. Of course you shouldn't eat stones, pointing to the fact that some things just aren't acceptable, such as using fellow humans purely for breeding, no matter the situation. All three interconnect through imagery of produce and consumption. They're juxtaposed, placed side by side, and very strange and weird, but they foreshadow Gilead's obsession with producing offspring for those at the top of the hierarchy. Each one highlights the moral wrongdoing of Gilead's regime. One should not force the handmaids to reproduce with somebody who isn't their partner. Surrogacy is one thing in our modern society, but this is a very warped version of it. Equally, Swift's satire, his humour, again links to the idea of having a callous concept of what it is to produce and rear children. We slept in what had once been the gymnasium. The floor was of varnished wood, with stripes and circles painted on it for the games that were formerly played there. The hoops for the basketball nets were still in place, though the nets were gone. A balcony ran around the room for the spectators, and I thought I could smell, faintly like an after-image, the pungent scent of sweat, shot through with the sweet taint of chewing gum and perfume from the watching girls, felt skirted as I knew from pictures, later in miniskirts, then pants, then in one earring, spiky green streaked hair. Dances would have been held there. The music lingered, a palimpsest of unheard sound, style upon style, an undercurrent of drums, a forlorn wail, garlands made of tissue paper flowers, cardboard devils, a revolving ball of mirrors, powdering the dancers with a snow of light. So subtle as it may be, straight away in this opening paragraph, Atwood makes a use of a metaphor for the repurposing of this school gymnasium as the sleeping quarters, the dorm of the handmaids. This ex-school has been turned into the Rachel and Leah Centre, otherwise known as the Red Centre. And she describes the repurposing of the gym hall as a palimpsest of unheard sounds of prior proms and summer balls, things like that. The use of the term palimpsest here refers to a document being written over. And you might think of the way that if you've ever watched one of those heist films, like the Thomas Crown Affair, where somebody has hidden a painting behind another painting by painting over the top of it, you might describe that as a palimpsest. The reason that this has a thematic relevance to the whole novel, and I'm going to throw in an enormous spoiler here straight away, is that by the end of the novel we get to the fictional, historical notes. Don't make the mistake of not reading those thinking that they're not part of the story. They are. And we get the revelation that the whole tale, the whole story, has been unearthed in an archaeological dig by historians who have found a set of cassette tapes. Offred, our narrator, has actually recorded this story, not written it down. That gives us some ambiguity about whether she actually escaped the regime or whether she only escaped to a safe house whereby she still had to do something clandestine in hiding, and if that was the case, was only able to record to cassette. That's suggested by the fact that the cassettes are actually described as being camouflaged. There's a piece of music at the beginning and end of each to make it seem like it's just a pop music cassette or whatever, to seem natural and safe. They're also not labelled and therefore jumbled up. And so the historian, who we will analyse in greater detail at the end of this course, transcribes these and has to make his best guesstimate of what order they should lie in, thus rendering the story a palimpsest. He's written over it. And Atwood's message here, excuse the motorbike, is that with that kind of rewriting, it may cover over with sexist male attitudes the story that Atwood, Offred, wanted to tell. It turns her story into history, which has the patriarchal pronoun his within it. Offred also throughout goes on to talk about rewriting bits and pieces of her tale for emotional purposes and needs. So, subtle as it may be to call the repurposing of the gym a palimpsest, that's something that would be really impressive and subtle for you to analyse in a response, to make it carry multiple times throughout the novel with real analytical emphasis. There was an old sex in the room, and loneliness, and expectation of something without shape or name. I remember that yearning, for something that was always about to happen and was never the same as the hands that were on us there and then, in the small of the back, or out back in the parking lot, or in the television room with the sound turned down with only the pictures flickering over lifting flesh. We yearned for the future. How did we learn it? That talent for insatiability, for not being able to get enough. Something that she certainly wouldn't be able to indulge in the oppressive regime of Gilead later. It was in the air, and it was still in the air, an afterthought as we tried to sleep in the army cots that had been set up in rows, with spaces between so we could not talk. We had flannelette sheets, like children's, and army issue blankets, old ones that still said US. We folded our clothes neatly and laid them on the stools at the end of the beds. The lights were turned down, but not out. Aunt Sarah and Aunt Elizabeth patrolled. They had cattle prods slung on thongs from their leather belts. Note the semantic field of things here that would brutally punish and control. They're treated as children, no lights out, no talking, and a cattle prod, an electric shock as punishment if not. No guns though. Even they could not be trusted with guns. Guns were for the guards, specially picked from the angels. The guards weren't allowed inside the building except when called, and we weren't allowed out except for our walks, twice daily, 2 by 2 around the football field, which was enclosed now by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The angels stood outside it with their backs to us. They were objects of fear to us, but of something else as well. If only they would look. If only we could talk to them. Something could be exchanged, we thought. Some deal made, some trade-off. We still had our bodies. That was our fantasy. We learned to whisper almost without sound. In the semi-darkness, we could stretch out our arms when the aunts weren't looking and touch each other's hands across space. We learned to lip read, our heads flat on the beds, turned sideways, watching each other's mouths. In this way, we exchanged names from bed to bed. Alma, Janine, Dolores, Moira, June. The opening chapter ends with the handmaids defying the regime, and instead of letting it erase their former identities with patronymic naming, they give each other a whispered or a mouthed name. Throughout the novel, we never explicitly learn Offred's former name. However, all the other names above, Alma, Janine, Dolores, Moira, are mentioned again elsewhere. So we might subtly infer Offred is actually called June. However, I actually think that on a first reading of the novel, that's pretty subtle and is actually quite easy to miss. In the novel, we're never sure of Offred's christened name, and I think that really serves to turn the volume up on and emphasise the sense of oppression of this totalitarian regime, and especially its parallels to ideas like slavery. I do teach film studies as well as literature, and therefore I'm not one who's going to say the film is never as good as the book. They're different media and they require adaptation. I really like the Hulu series for TV. I didn't like the film adaptation from the 1990s of The Handmaid's Tale. It's got some brilliant people in it. It's got Richardson in it. It's got Faye Dunaway in it. But unfortunately, it removes the peril and it removes the sense of oppression, particularly by giving Offred her real name. I don't know if you've seen the Hulu TV series or if you can have a quick look at some clips on YouTube, but if you can get hold of the last few seconds of episode 1 of the first season, Elizabeth Moss's performance looks straight at camera, breaking the fourth wall, and very strongly asserts that her name is June. And I just wonder whether, perhaps as a point of minor criticism, that makes for a real diminishment of the sense of oppression that's captured within the novel. Just a concluding thought until next time. Thank you very much, everybody. I hate to do it, but if you have got this far and you found it useful, I'd be incredibly grateful for a subscription, a like, because at the end of the day, that gives me the opportunity to have the algorithms of YouTube get this out, shared to more people. Thank you, and see you next time.